So where we left off, we were talking about the emission sources, wrapped up the emission sources. One question I always like to ask the group at this point is, do you have you guys encountered any emission sources that are not on our list that we haven't even talked about? There's always a few one-off scenarios that people encounter. I think I already know what you're going to ask or mention. Probably glycol units and amine units for.
Well, that's fine. I wasn't going to necessarily bring it up in control device. I thought it was a control device. And that's
Yep. Vapor recovery unit.
You kind of indirectly mentioned it.
Vapor recovery unit is going to operate very similar to your other combustion control devices, depending on how it's being used. Some vapor recovery units recover all of the vapor back into the process. Others will have a flare or something to control what streams don't get brought back into the process. Yeah. What? Nope, didn't do a lot of dust stuff. Did mention, usually the reason we don't do a lot of dust stuff is because they are also another type of process vent. So you would calculate the emissions very similarly to what you would do with a process vent. Calculate a flow rate of your particulate matter through that vent and apply a control efficiency to the bag house that you would use to control those emissions. Sometimes with bag houses, they don't use a control efficiency. They have an emission rate leaving the bag house. So you would have a volumetric flow rate. Remember we talked about the difference between mass and volumetric, converting between the two. Well, this would be an instance where you use a volumetric flow rate, and some of the bag houses have an emission factor based on your volumetric flow rate leaving, coming out of that bag house. So it'll usually be in terms of pounds per standard cubic feet leaving that bag house.
And that's preferred because there's PM deviation, right? There's PM, PM10, PM2.5, and bag housing is different efficiency for each one. So if you have different sizes of PM going into the bag house, you don't have the same collection efficiency across all species of PM. So second, the method that you brought up is preferred method of calculation.
And then, like I said, if you're working in the oil and gas industry, you're going to encounter amine units and glycol units that are a type of process that uses a modeling program to estimate emissions. I've had somebody mention once, that they calculated emissions from air conditioning, replacing the air conditioning fluid. I don't necessarily see those as being permitted, but it would be considered a maintenance activity. Anybody else have any other sources that they've come across? All right. So to review, what are the different types of emission sources? We covered a bunch. What was one of them that we covered? Somebody? A little bit of audience participation. Tanks, flares, control devices, wastewater, cooling towers, process vents. Very good. What are the most common resources for calculating emissions? That'd be good for your wastewater. AP42, emission factors, vendor data, all good answers. Ideal gas law. Can you identify any additional? I just asked that. Okay. that can be skipped. So now that I've gotten everybody's thoughts disorganized by the earlier stuff, talking about the history and the different types of permits, now we're going to try to tie it all back together and determine, what are the actual requirements that trigger PSD permits? What are the requirements that trigger? What are the emissions limits that trigger non-attainment permits? And what are the emission limits that trigger Title V permits? So the first thing we need to cover is potential to emit versus your actual emissions versus the maximum rate. So when we refer to potential to emit, it's defined in 40 CFR section 52.21, and it's the maximum capacity of a stationary source to emit a pollutant under its physical or operational design. Any physical or operational limitation on the capacity of the source to emit a pollutant, including air pollution control equipment and restrictions on hours or operation or on the type of amount of fuel combusted, stored, or processed, shall be treated as part of its design if the limitation or the effect it would have on emissions is federally enforceable. So what this means for you is PTE is used to determine your applicability to, as it pertains to being a major source. That 100 tons limit that we talked about refers to the PTE of the entire facility. And so you would take every individual source that you have at that facility, add them up all together, or add up all the emissions together, and that would be your PTE for the site. But the one thing that is covered on the second part of this, after the first sentence, is that if you have a physical or operational limitation and you make that federally enforceable, that allows you to reduce your PTE. So what that means is if you have a process vent and you send it to a control device, that is a operational limit, that's a physical limit that you've placed, and by putting that control device into your permit, it becomes federally enforceable. And so that would be, we'd be reducing your VOC emissions from that process vents, and therefore you would have a lower PTE. Similarly, when authorizing storage tanks or loading operations, a lot of times we'll calculate emissions using the capacity of the pump that is feeding your fixed roof storage tank or emptying out your IFR or feeding your loading operations. That would be a physical limitation that can be used to establish your PTE for those types of emission sources. Another operational limitation would be temperature. If you can't, if you're loading something and you're loading at ambient air temperature, there's nothing to heat it. That would be an operational limitation that is used to limit your emissions and limit your PTE. Typically with a flare, when you're operating a flare, you can have supplemental fuel gas going to that flare by putting a limitation, an operational limitation on how much you're feeding it. That would be a limit that establishes your PTE lower for your combustion products from your flare. So there's all sorts of little details that you can falls under that category, but as long as it's in a permit that as long as it's in any permit, whether it's a state permit or if you've already obtained a PSD non-attainment permit, it's in that permit. By being in a permit and you're having your state be under the state having a state implementation plan, that means it is a federally enforceable document, and that's allows you to those emissions that are authorized by that permit is what becomes your PTE. There's also some state-specific other maximums. For instance, if you have a state regulation that limits certain emissions from whatever your process, that would be something that would then define what your PTE is, because you can't exceed the emissions that a regulation is in place, and so that it would also be something that could establish your PTE. So we created this flow chart to help walk us through determining what type of permit we would need to apply for. And the very first question that's asked is the site major? So in this case, we need to calculate our PTE to determine whether or not our site is major. So applicability is based on the potential to emit for the entire site, and you would then compare that against your major source thresholds. So without looking ahead, does everybody remember what our Title V emission major source thresholds were? 100 tons for your criteria pollutants.
100 and non-attainment, and 250 in
Close. So 100 tons per year for criteria pollutants. I'll go to it. Any HAP, it would be 10 tons of any individual HAP, 25 tons for your total HAPs. Any other pollutants, remember those sulfur compounds would have that 100 ton per year limit. The 250 tons that you've mentioned, those are your PSD limits that define PSD major source thresholds. So first we look to see, are we a major source under Title V? This table works for both the Title V operating permit and for your PSD non-attainment construction permits. You just need to apply the correct thresholds to follow the flow chart. So the first thing we're looking at is Title V, and we look at these thresholds. And then your major source thresholds for non-attainment areas are lower your requirements. If you're if you're in a severe non-attainment area for ozone, for example, you have a threshold of 25 tons, and that applies to your Title V permits as well. So this is the trigger for non-attainment permits, but it's also the same trigger for your Title V permit in this case, which is slightly different than the PSD threshold. So one thing that we do in the 2-day course is we go a little bit more in depth in the calculations. We give some calculation examples, throw together a sample project, and so we've skipped that part of the step, the actual calculating of the emissions, and but we still have this project that we're going to use as an example to walk through case-by-case basis of this flow chart. And so prior to this project, your site had an existing PTE of 95 tons per year of VOC, 125 tons per year of NOx, 110 tons per year of CO, 10 tons per year of PM, and 7.5 tons per year of SO2. We had emissions from a bunch of different sources, and it increased our PTE. And so now we're at 100.59 tons of VOCs, 150.58 tons of NOx, 118 tons of CO, so on and so forth. Because our criteria pollutants for Title V are 100 tons per year for all these criteria pollutants. We look at them to see if we are a major source. Well, prior to this project, we were a major source for NOx and CO. And after this project, we're a major source for NOx, CO, and VOC. So before we were a major source, after we were a major source, we just added VOC as one of the pollutants that is also making us a major source. So that way, if you were to go back and reduce NOx and CO emissions, removing a combustion device, for instance, and your VOC were still above 100 tons, you're still a major source for VOC and just VOC. But in this case, really nothing has changed regarding our major source applicability. If we were below 100 tons of NOx and CO before the project, we would now be a major source after the project. So PSD applicability is determined in a very similar way, but there's a few other caveats to look at. So the first bullet point under PSD applicability is a new major source. So what this means is that if you are constructing a new facility, new source in this case, and any one of those pollutants is above your major source thresholds for PSD, you are applicable to PSD. If you are in a non-attainment area, the non-attainment thresholds would apply to the PSD at this point. Now, if you are making a modification to a facility, you have two different things to look at. The first is, were you a major source before the project? Are you a major source after the project? So if you're a major source before the project, you have higher thresholds. You don't trigger PSD until you cross the lower project thresholds until you are actually a major source. If you are a major source before the project, you have lower thresholds for your project increases. And one thing to talk about is affected sources. So remember that the boiler is a good example of something that we've talked about, something that we're not actually physically changing the boiler, but it's providing additional steam to the unit. So it's going to burn at a higher rate and for a longer period of time during the year. And so there's increases emissions from that source, but it's not actually changing. Well, those emissions, you still add up the emissions from that boiler, and it counts towards our total. So the major source thresholds for under PSD was the 100 for the listed sources and 250 tons for the non-listed sources. Skip the GHGs because they come out on the next slide, which has different thresholds. You still have that 100 and 250 tons for your mass basis, but once you multiply it by the global warming potential of the GHGs, you get a CO2 equivalent, and you'll compare your thresholds against the 175,000 tons. And so if you are an existing major source under PSD, you don't necessarily have a PSD permit at this point, but you're making a change at your facility that is a major source. So we'll talk as if we're a refinery chemical plant in this instance. So we're above 100 tons in NOx, CO, or VOC, any one of those criteria pollutants. And we make a modification at our facility. We now look at the modification levels. These are these significant impact levels that we talked about earlier. So for CO, it's still at 100 tons. But for NOx, it's 40. SO2, it's 40. VOC and NOx as precursors to ozone are 40. PM is 25, PM10 is 15, PM2.5 is 10, lead is 0.6 tons. And then we also got some major source modification thresholds for non-criteria pollutants such as fluorides, sulfuric acid, mist, H2S, total reduced sulfur, and reduced sulfur compounds. And so what you're looking at in this case, well, in the first case, here you're looking at your PTE for your site. In this case, you're looking at your project increases. So if you're a major source already, are your project increases greater than these modification levels? So as we discussed earlier, our project was a major source prior to the project. So we were already a major source. So we go down to the next answer. Is the project increase major? We need to calculate our project increases against these source thresholds. If we were answering this as we were a Title V basis, Title V permit doesn't necessarily answer this question because for Title V applicability, it only matters if your source is a major source or not. If you're a major source, you have to obtain a Title V permit. If you're not a major source, you don't have to attain a Title V permit. So if you're looking at this flow chart as for the purposes of Title V, it doesn't really matter which way you go on this end because the end results here is Title V, Title V, and Title V. So if you're a major source, you're automatically Title V. If you're not, notice how the end point here is not a Title V permit. So now we're going to take a look at this is if we're looking at it at PSD, is the site major? We're greater than 100 tons, so we're a major source. Now is the project increase major? So to determine project increases for PSD applicability, if the project increases are less than the major modification levels without regard to decreases, the second step in determining our increases, which is referred to as netting, is not required. If we are less than the major modification levels on our project, we don't trigger PSD permitting. Non-attainment programs are operated by the states for each non-attainment area, thus netting triggers vary by non-attainment area. So going back to these major modification levels, for non-attainment, what triggers netting is not going to match these tables. It's going to be in your state implementation plan. So you got to refer to your state regulations if you're in a non-attainment area and figure out what that threshold is to trigger netting. For an example, in Houston-Galveston area, we have a major modification level for VOC and NOx of 5 tons per year. If your project is greater than 5 tons per year, you would then go on to netting. And once you do the netting step, it actually has a different threshold, which is 25 tons per year. So, like I said, non-attainment programs are in how to comply with non-attainment permitting is all within your state implementation plan. And a lot of states will have lower thresholds than what is required by federal regulations, because the goal of the non-attainment permits is to get your non-attainment area in compliance with your national ambient air quality standards. So the first step involves determining our baseline emissions to compare against our proposed emissions. Our project increases are determined from what our proposed emissions are going to be after the project, so our PTE after the project, subtracted by the baseline emissions. The baseline emissions are based off of the 2002 NSR reform rules that were passed, and it's determined from any consecutive 24-month period in the past 10 years. So what you are doing is taking a look back at the past 10 years worth of emissions. If you really want to be specific, you'll actually pull up your emissions on a month-by-month basis to pick out a consecutive 24-month period that is the highest in that period. And that is what you'll calculate as your baseline actual emissions. The period can be different for each emission type. So the period that we take, the 24-month period, can be different for each of the different pollutants. If we're doing this exercise for VOC and CO, we don't have to use the same time period for those two pollutants. And the process is basically the same for PSD and non-attainment. I'm not aware of any real differences in determining baseline emissions for PSD versus non-attainment. A lot of clients that don't have a very long history in terms of their emission sources might not go back as far as 10 years in looking at emissions. Or if they know they've made enough process changes in the last couple of years and already know that their highest emissions are going to be what they've operated the last 2 years, they might use the past 24 months as their baseline emissions. So how you determine which ones you wanted to use is up to you. You don't necessarily have to choose the highest, but it works in your favor to not trigger PSD non-attainment if you take the highest of that 24-month period. So for PSD applicability, we have proposed our project and we've already calculated our emission increases. So in that project we had new emission sources that included new fugitives, a new engine, a new IFR tank, and we modified some existing sources that included loading and process vents that went to a flare, and we had an affected source of a boiler due to increased steam demand. And so the first step that we did is we determined our baseline emissions. In this case, we got our example is for VOCs, and Because the fugitives in the engine, the IFR tank are brand new sources, we don't have any baseline emissions. So our baseline emissions for these three sources are 0. For the boiler loading and the flare, we had existing emissions. We're just increasing the capacity. And this is a consecutive 24-month period broken up into the 2 years. We took the emissions from year 1 and year 2 in that 10-year period that are consecutive, and took the average of the two and got our project baseline emissions for those three sources. Added them up all together, and we got 1.34 tons of VOC in our baseline emissions. We calculated our project emissions to be 7.08 tons. So in order to obtain our project increases, we take the 7.08 tons minus the 1.34 tons, and our project increase is 5.74 tons per year of VOC. We compare that to our PSD thresholds of 40 tons and find that this project doesn't trigger PSD because our project emissions are below 40 tons. Yep. So a lot of times, most clients are reporting their annual emissions in the emissions inventory, and that's the only resource that they have to obtain their actual emissions during the baseline, that 10-year baseline period. And so they will usually have their emissions on an annual basis, and so taking year 1 and year 2 that are consecutive is the easiest way for them to determine what their baseline emissions are. I've recently been involved with a project where we needed to get our emissions increase as low as possible in order to pass PSD modeling. And so we had to pull up the actual data that went into calculating their emissions for their emissions inventory on a month-by-month basis, and calculated all the baseline actual emissions from a specific time period with ending points that are in the middle of the year. It's still going on. It's about a year and a half. So here we display it as 2 separate years, but really you're taking, in this case it'd be the average of the 2 years, but really you're taking your 24-month period and determining what your emissions are for that 24-month period and getting an annual emission rate to get your baseline emissions. Anybody else have any questions so far? Did I get anybody lost yet? Go for it.
So let's say they didn't have month-to-month data, then they would take their numbers from the CI and take the average of it, and then we would go back that.
Correct. State agencies will accept it either way, as long as you document where you obtained and how you obtained your actual emissions from in the past, and clearly define what they were and how you calculated them. They won't have any problem accepting them. We did the same thing with our NOx, CO, PM, SO2. So we have combustion sources. Our engine was new, so those are 0. Our baseline yearly determined from that 24-month period. I abbreviated it here. So that's our baseline emissions, our flare head, NOx, and CO. Summed them all up. Go down to the next line. So here we have our project baseline. Here's our calculated project emissions, and then our project increase. And as you can see, all of our project increases are below our PSD thresholds for that project. So in this case, VOC, NOx, CO, PM, SO2, they're all below our modification thresholds, and so the project would not trigger PSD permitting. Now, if this were Non-attainment, if we're looking at this for non-attainment applicability, you're located in a non-attainment area. These comparison to the thresholds would be lower, depending on where what kind of what you're designated as ozone non-attainment county. Your NOx and VOC might be 25 tons, in which case you would be triggering non-attainment for your NOx because it would be above the 25 tons per year. And in which case you would go on to the next step is the net increase major. So if you are above these major source thresholds here, these modification thresholds, we now move on to the next step, and that we go on to the step that's referred to as netting. So is the net increase major? Well, in order to do that, we need to determine our net increases. It's triggered if the project increases exceed major source modification levels, so that's what triggers netting. It's a 5-year look back from the start of construction through the start of operation. So the contemporaneous netting period begins 5 years before the start of construction of your project, and it ends when at the start of the operation of your project. So it's 5 years plus the time it takes for you to begin construction and start operating. It includes all the projects that are in that contemporaneous netting period, that are in that window, that time frame, and it includes both the increases and decreases. So you add up all the emission increases from all the projects that you did. If you've done projects to reduce emissions, maybe you've decided you wanted to do more frequent monitoring of your fugitive components. That would be a decrease that you can include in your contemporaneous netting window. Maybe you've installed more efficient control devices to reduce VOCs. Those would be examples of decreases that can be go into your contemporaneous netting window. The one thing that need to be sure about those decreases, though, is that they need to be certified. So just because we add a more efficient control device doesn't mean that we have a decrease. We need to get that into a permit, get it certified, get it federally enforceable, and then we have a federally enforceable decrease in our netting window. And it's the sum of all the increases and decreases as compared to the major modification levels. And if that is exceeded, the major source permitting is then triggered. So after we've added up all of our emission increases and decreases, if they're also above the major modification levels, that's when we trigger PSD or non-attainment. Here's a visual description of the contemporaneous period, that window. So like I said, we got our start of construction here, go 5 years back, and it's June of 2009 is the start of our contemporaneous period, and then it goes until we started operation in March of 2015. So our contemporaneous window for all projects are from June of 2009 to March of 2015.
You have to pay special attention if you're doing PSD or non-attainment to the start of construction and start of operation date, because when you are writing up your permit, when you're preparing your permit application, you're years in advance of the project, and your netting window is built around those things. And if they move, then your window has moved, and you have to go and re-net. And I've seen projects that, for some economic reason, the, VP or whatever says, well, we need to move this down to the next fiscal year, and then some big decrease back in 2009 falls out of the window, and suddenly the project is PSD, because they just moved construction back again, right? The same thing can happen with normal operation, right? Start of operation, which is the construction gets delayed for whatever reason, and then something else comes online at the plant, they're starting up 2 units, and things get out of order, and it trips up the netting, and it'll mess everything up. So you have to pay special attention to start of construction, start of operation, because it'll move your netting window around what you previously thought was not a PSD project.
Another thing you need to be aware of is this green area right in here. So you're usually working on your permit application in this area, because you're getting your permit before you begin construction, you have to predict and you have to know what projects are going to go in this period that might take place before before the operation of a major process change, and include them in the PSD applicability determination. So if you're doing lots of little small projects in here, they can add up to large sum of emissions in your contemporaneous window. So be aware that, especially, you receive your MOC for a major project, but you need to communicate with the rest of the plant to figure out what other small projects are they going to complete in the time it takes to finish that big project. So, is the net increase major? If it's not, so if we go through this netting process and the emissions are below the major modification levels, so I'll back up to this step. If we're looking at PSD, these are our major modification levels. If our net contemporaneous period is below these levels, then we only trigger a state-only NSR permit, and we'll have to have a Title V permit. If that net increase is major, then we need to figure out if it's PSD or non-attainment. Which permit are we looking at? Which thresholds are we looking at? So if it's the PSD thresholds, we're triggering the PSD permit in Title V. If we're looking at the non-attainment thresholds, we're triggering non-attainment permit in Title V. Anybody have any questions to this point? Yep. What was the slide, the original one? 44. So this would be the slide for PSD.
And then when you were on slide 144, you were saying that how we determine the negative trigger is if it's in the state.
So this table refers to the major modification levels under PSD. And this, it's the state implementation plan that determines the major modification thresholds under non-attainment permits. So when you're looking at your construction permits, you first figure out if you're in a non-attainment or an attainment county. If you're in an attainment county, you're only going to be looking at PSD. If you're in a non-attainment county, you got to look at PSD and the non-attainment thresholds. And those non-attainment modification thresholds are going to be based off of your state implementation plan. So whereas PSD, let's make sure I found the right one. So for PSD, our major source modification, so our project modification levels are going to be this table, as well as our contemporaneous window is going to have the same modification levels. With the non-attainment permits, because it's the states operating the plans, you might have a lower project modification threshold and a higher contemporaneous window modification level. So in Houston, our first level is 5 tons for the project, and then it's 25 tons for the net contemporaneous window. So if we have a 5-ton project, we go into netting, and then if our contemporaneous window has no emissions in it, this is our only project, we're below the 25 tons, and we can go ahead with this project and not trigger non-attainment permitting. Does that answer that question? All right. And then, so I'd like to back up a small step. Is the site major? No. So if you're at an existing site that's not a major source, the next step that you would look at is the project itself major? So what we're looking at in this specific example is the site major, and that is whether or not the site is major before the project actually occurs. So in this very first step, we're looking at, was the site major before you even began this project? If that's not the case, then the project itself has to be major in order to drop down to this bottom PSD non-attainment scenario. So what that means is that if you were at 99 tons of all of your criteria pollutants, you're not a major source yet. So then you go to this next bullet, next box, is the project itself major? You can do another you can do another project that is 99 tons of emissions of any of your criteria pollutants. So your total emissions for your site is going to be 198 tons of NOx, VOC, whatever it is, and it will not trigger PSD permitting. And that is because you were not a major source before you began the project. And is the project itself major? Well, it's below 100 tons. So the project itself isn't a major source. So you fall under this category. Now, any project after that, you're at this first step and you're answering yes, because now you're above your 100 tons threshold for PSD applicability. So it's something that's not as well known is that if you are not at a major source before you begin your project, you have higher thresholds to complete your project in that doesn't trigger the PSD non-attainment permitting. All right, any questions on that? Did I lose anybody?
So what you're saying is technically, I can have a site which is a major source, but I don't need any of the paperwork to be.
Right, you can have a major source and not necessarily have a PSD permit. So if you're in an existing major source and you do a project, you have to look at the smaller thresholds. If you're not a major source, you're still looking at that 100 tons for your project.
So, well, okay, so say you're not a major source, your project is by itself is not a major source, right? After you become.
So that project will not trigger PSD permitting.
No, I think what he's asking is, like example that what you said is you're at 99 and another one's 99 and you're at 198 right now.
Yep.
Permit expires, you go for permit renewal, then what happens?
Because you're not increasing emissions, your permit renewal is still going to be that minor source permit that your state requires.
The difference between Title V and PSD is pre-construction authorization. So for PSD, you're coming in for a project. Title V, you're coming in for operation and continued operation. So Title V, as soon as your PTE crosses over the Title V major source threshold, then you're a major source. And it's not based on when the project happens or the next project or how big the project was. It's just whenever you're above the Title V major source threshold, you're in a major source and you need a Title V permit. For PSD, it's project by project. And if the project isn't big enough to require a PSD permit, then you can be a PSD major source without a PSD project. Because you never had a PSD project. You're just a PSD major source. But you never have a project big enough to require a PSD permit. Right? If every project that you did was just a 5-ton increase, or a 4-ton increase, let's say 4-ton increase, and every project was 4 tons, you did 4 tons, 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 4 tons.
You'll need the Title V as soon as you cross over the Title V major source thresholds.
That's regardless of when it happens.
Yes. So that's the one slight difference between the construction permit and the Title V permit is that in the construction permits, you're answering this is the site major question before your project, you have your project. With the Title V, you're answering this question for after the project. Does that clarify what you're asking? Okay.
I'm getting, but are
Not quite.
Well, now
Almost.
you're major, so now you're comparing against the 40 level.
So now you're looking at the 40 tons.
40 tons.
Oh, okay.
So you can do a 99, a 99, and then a 39 and not trigger PSD.
Title V based on
And Title V is based on the site PTE, and it's determined regardless of the project. It's if you're operating a major source, so your entire facility is above that major source threshold, then you automatically have to get a Title V permit.
So a PTE for a boiler would be, is operating at 100% capacity for 24 hours a day. That's right.
That's how you permit. If you put a permit condition said I'm only going to operate this boiler for 6 months out of each year, you wouldn't have to necessarily authorize the emissions for a full year. You can authorize it for the 6 months, get it put into an NSR permit through your state, and that becomes a federally enforceable limit. And so instead of 100 tons, that boiler is operating at 50 tons, and that's what your PTE is. All right. So now we're going to have a little bit of a breakout. We're going to basically go through this exercise with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 examples. So we got some handouts for you. Go ahead and give one of the.
These, yeah.
I'll do these. So Matt is handing out a bigger version of the chart, and I'm handing out the examples. And our first starts with a table of our major source thresholds and major modification thresholds as well. So I'm going to give everybody about 5 minutes to go through this on their own and take a look at it and see if you can start figuring some of the stuff out. And then after about 5 minutes, we'll get back together and we'll walk through each one of these steps. But this way you get a little bit of practice on your own, make sure you understand it, and then we'll walk through these together.
We can work in teams.
If you want to work with people at your table, feel free to do so. There's no set rules to this. All right. We're going to start walking through these answers. All right. So the first one, our VOC site PTE before the project was 55 tons. We're in an attainment ozone area. Our project increase is 25 tons, and our net emission increase is 55 tons. Was everybody able to go through this one? What did everybody get for it? Correct. And the reason is our PTE is below 100 tons per year. And so even with the increase, our PTE after it, or this PTE increase would need to be above 100 tons in order to trigger PSD permitting. The next project we would do if this was another 25 tons per year, we would be at 70, 80 tons, and so we could still do another 25 ton project and still not trigger PSD. And then it'd be the third one that we would start having to look at our project increases compared to the 40. So we got two more 25 ton per year projects with a PTE this low. And it's also notable that this net emission increase doesn't even matter. And really this project increase, or just the net, I guess, yeah, just the net increase doesn't even matter because this was not a major source, or it was below the major source thresholds. All right, next question, number 2. VOC site PT is 155, still located in attainment, same project increase and slightly lower net emission increase. What did you get for this one? Correct, and that's because our PTE was above 100 tons, so we're above the major source thresholds for Title V. We had to look at the project increase. It was below 40 tons, and so we looked at our net emission increase, and that was also below 40 tons, and so triggers the state-only permits in the Title V. How about the next one, 155, 45, and 35? State and Title V, good. So this one, because we're above 45 or above the 40 ton threshold for the project increase, we had to look at the net increase to make sure that it was above 40 tons, and it wasn't, so it's state only. Line 4, 155 attainment, project increase of 45, and net emission increase of 65. Correct. So both the project increase and the net increase are above 40 tons and triggers the PSD permit. Next line, number 5, 155 tons. In this case, we're in a non-attainment severe. So you have to look at the modification levels for the severe. And in this case, I think we said, what did I say? 25. So what is this one? I heard different answers. State and Title V is the correct one. So we're above major source thresholds, so with 155. We look at the 25 ton increase for the project, and in this case it was. But because the net emission increase was below 25 tons, we had some decreases. You know, basically we had 25 tons of decreases in our netting contemporaneous period. So in that case, we didn't trigger the non-attainment permit. So in this case, the project increase is 45, and we're comparing that against the 25 ton per year threshold. Depending on your state implementation plan, that 25 tons per year might end up being 5 tons per year. Some states will keep the same 25 tons for both the project and for the modification. And that same 25 tons is what triggers the major modification, or triggers the major source definition under Title V. So in this case, anything in this category above 25 tons would put you into Title V permit status. Anything above 25 tons here would put you into, trigger the netting, and anything here above 25 tons puts you into a non-attainment permit, if everything else holds true.
So when you're looking at traffic increase, you have to know whether you're in attainment or not.
Correct.
You're looking at that, so
Yep.
PSD goes out, but, you know, it's not attainment, not what it is.
Not necessarily. You can still trigger PSD and non-attainment at the same time for different pollutants. So for this, in this case, because we're only looking at VOCs, we're only looking at the non-attainment, and you wouldn't trigger the PSD for the VOC. Correct. Yep.
So that would,
Well, actually, it can't be PSD and not attainment or no. But that's because one of them's for ozone and one of them's for primary. That's the secondary.
what was the answer for that one?
So this one is state only and Title V. And the reason why it's state only is because of this 20 right here.
Right.
But in Texas, the netting threshold is 5.
5 and 25.
Well, it's only 25 in Wayne County. The netting threshold. The major mod for non-attainment is 25. The netting threshold is 5.
Right.
Except in Wayne County.
So as Matt is pointing out, in Texas, other than one specific county, this increase under severe non-attainment is actually 5 tons per year, and then this one is still going to be 25. In this case, we're looking in general terms. I think Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I think it's 25 and 25. And so it really depends on your specific area. The one thing I know for sure is that with a severe non-attainment area, it's not going to be any higher than 25. They are required by federal law to be 25 tons or less. Texas decided that they wanted to be more proactive about trying to lower emissions, and so they triggered the netting step at a lower threshold. All right, next line, 155, 45, and 35. Correct, non-attainment in Title V. That's because these two are both above 25 tons per year. What about the last one? Trick question. It's just non-attainment in Title V. Because we're in the non-attainment area and we're triggering the non-attainment thresholds, we're just going to be a non-attainment for that pollutant. If this was if this was, let's say, CO, CO it wouldn't even apply because it's 100 tons. But what's another 40 ton? SO2? It's 40 tons. So let's say this was SO2. Well, you're not attainment for ozone, so you're looking at the 40 tons per year for VOC and NOx, and so you'd trigger non-attainment for VOC since we're looking at VOC. Now, if this were the same numbers for our SO2, we would be only PSD for SO2 because we're not in a non-attainment county for SO2. So in this case, we're just triggering non-attainment. And that was the question that you were asking earlier, is can you trigger PSD and non-attainment at the same time, which is if you're in a non-attainment county, you're triggering just non-attainment. You're looking.
You look at PSD with the other criteria.
Correct. Yep.
Potentially be for NOx, because you're not attainment for ozone, precursors of being NOx and VOC, but there is also a BACT standard for NOx.
What? I'm confused now. So in this case, we're looking at just VOCs. So in this example, we're non-attainment for just VOC. If we were looking at other pollutants, all right. Gets a little chaotic when you're.
But I guess what I'm after is for me. I mean, if you're not attainment, you cannot attain. You're not looking.
That is my understanding. I could be wrong though.
That is my understanding. There's something, I mean, not attainment would give you stricter requirements here at the beginning.
Right. By the time you implement the control technology for a non-attainment permit that you're triggering, your increases are not going to be 45 tons. Because you won't be able to pass non-attainment review and modeling and things like that when you're having 45 tons of increases. So by the time you actually get done with your application, you submit your application, these numbers are almost impossible. But my understanding is for one specific pollutant, you can only trigger non-attainment and not PSD. You're not even looking at the PSD. So Matt's going to double check for me. I could ask our experts up in the other course who are also spend about a half day on just this process alone, because there's a lot more intricacies on determining our project increases. There's a lot of other options available to you to get that project increase as small as possible to get yourself out of PSD and non-attainment permitting. And
What's confusing about it is some compounds are precursors to others for secondary formation. Like I know for PM 2.5, you're going to start seeing SO2 and NOx issues for PM 2.5 because they're precursor compounds to PM 2.5 formations. They're actually working.
so what I think we're probably getting a little bit confused on is if this were NOx, and we were looking at just our NOx here, for NO2 is one of the criteria pollutants, and that has a 40 ton per year threshold for PSD, but it is not included in. The NO2 is included as a part of all of your NOx. So you got to look at your NO2 and your NOx versus their individual thresholds. So you can be non-attainment for NOx, but PSD for the NO2. I think that's where we're getting a little bit confused on. Is that what I was getting?
We're there. No way to verify it.
All right.
What it all comes down to is you could end up with PSD permit and a non-attainment permit, depending on some criteria.
Right. Correct. So if you have a project, you definitely could have a PSD and a non-attainment permit. It's just you'd be non-attainment for that specific pollutant that triggers the non-attainment, and PSD for another pollutant that triggers the PSD applicability.
I have an answer. I've consulted the interweb. Yes, you can be both PSD and non-attainment for NOx. You cannot be both PSD and non-attainment for VOC, because VOC does not have an NAAQS. So there's no NAAQS standard for VOC. There's a NAAQS standard for ozone. So if you're in an ozone non-attainment area, there's a NAAQS standard, right? You can be above this concentration for ozone, you cannot be above this concentration for NOx, right? So while you're in a non-attainment area for ozone, that area is in attainment for NOx. So you're in non-attainment area for ozone, PSD area for NOx. So a project can be non-attainment and PSD for NOx. But there is no NAAQS for VOC. So it's going to be one or the other.
So going back to the earliest slides when we first talked about criteria pollutants, these are the criteria pollutants that have a national ambient air quality standard for them. And because they have a national ambient air quality standard for them, they can trigger the non-attainment regulations if that area isn't meeting your NACs. So as you can see, there is an NO2 criteria pollutant that's separately listed, but there is no VOC. The VOC and NOx are precursors to the ozone. So that's why, as Matt was singling out VOC, you can only trigger non-attainment for non-attainment for VOC, but the NOx can trigger non-attainment for under here or here, and then one of the other, it could be PSD if you're meeting your national ambient air quality standards for the other one. All right.
Okay, so in that pretty table that we had right here, okay, so the second column from the right, where we'll always be looking at our, comparing that to our PSD major source modification. Like, would there ever be an instance where we don't compare that to this?
In this column?
Yes.
No. You will always compare it to your major modification levels. It's the final column that you might get to skip out on if your project increase is below your major modification levels.
In Texas, you compare non-attainment to netting.
Yeah.
So if you're in Texas, if you're non-attainment, that project increase is compared to 5 times.
So we listed out major modification levels for PSD and for non-attainment. As a general rule of thumb, the non-attainment threshold to trigger netting, in this case Matt's referring to it as the netting threshold, that can vary based on the non-attainment area that you live in. And so in Texas we have it at 5 tons per year for a severe non-attainment for ozone. In other states that are severe or even moderate, that might be 25 tons per year. Baton Rouge, Louisiana is one example where I know that netting threshold is 25 tons per year. If you're in a marginal category for ozone, if there's a non-attainment area that's marginal, that threshold is 100 tons per year that on these two steps. And so it really depends on how your non-attainment area is designated and the state implementation rules that were instituted to establish step 1 or step 2 thresholds. So when Matt says netting threshold, that is our step 1 thresholds, and then our step 2 thresholds is that modification level. Like I said, in this case, we're looking at the modification levels for non-attainment as being the same, one and the same, but there's often instances where they can be different.
I'm sorry, y'all. I know that we said that just multiple times. So basically, the last 3 entries where it says non-attainment severe.
Yep.
I was looking at those 45. I should have been looking at that compared to.
The middle table, yes.
Oh,
Well, or Texas, if it was not being severe.
In this case, our non-attainment major source thresholds, step 1 and step 2 are 25. That middle table is just this project. This table will change. This table will change based on how your state is implementing non-attainment regulations. These are the minimum thresholds that the federal regulations require. So if your state wants to lower it so that you trigger non-attainment sooner, they're welcome to do so.
Okay, so that's kind of guidelines set,
Yep.
and they can adopt that, or they can adjust their.
Yep. And it's in the state's best interest to keep them as low as possible because based on the Clean Air Act, they need to be in compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And that's really the purpose of your non-attainment permits, is to bring your area back into compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Your PSD permits that apply to attainment areas, the very definition of PSD is prevention of significant deterioration. So they're trying to prevent you from entering into non-attainment status for those pollutants. And so that's the designation between the two types of permits. Does that make sense? All right, so if we didn't get everybody too confused, Matt and I will both be around afterwards, and you can ask questions if you want to on the side, and throughout various scenarios we can try to help you with those as well. So now we're going to talk about the permit application requirements for the two construction permits, the two federal construction permits, our non-attainment new source review, and our PSD permits. So first level is the control technology that's involved with both. Under non-attainment new source review, we've got LAIR, which is lowest achievable emission rate, versus PSD, which is our best available control technology. And we'll discuss the differences between the two. Specifically with non-attainment NSR, we have to purchase offsets, which are pollutant-specific offsets. So if you are non-attainment for VOC, you have to purchase VOC offsets. There's talk about interpollutant trading with the ozone non-attainment areas, swapping out the VOCs for NOx, but that still hasn't been approved yet. But it would definitely help a lot of the industry out if they could. They have to be creditable. So your offsets, basically they have to have been certified by state to certify that the emissions decreases did occur. Recent, so they have to have taken place in the last 2 years. Local, they only really apply to the non-attainment area that you're trying to construct your source in. So you're in Chicago and trigger non-attainment, you can't purchase offsets from California. And they're often very, very, very expensive to purchase offsets because a lot of facilities don't want to pass off their offsets to another company. They want to keep them for themselves so that they can use them to do their own projects. And if they leave them in their contemporaneous window, they don't convert the decreases into offsets. They can use that to net out of their non-attainment permits. With non-attainment permits, you have to do an alternative site analysis. So what that means is that if you are triggering a non-attainment permit, you have to justify why you didn't construct your source in an attainment area. Sometimes it's as simple as you're just doing an expansion at your facility that is that expansion triggers non-attainment permitting. It's not reasonable to do it at another location off-site because they would have to build a brand new unit, and you'd have even greater emissions in that attainment area than you would if you were doing the non-attainment. So there's a lot of little details that are involved with this alternative site analysis that at this point, if you're triggering non-attainment permitting, you're probably not going to be doing the permitting yourself. You'll be bringing in a bunch of experts to help you prepare these applications. And finally, non-attainment permits, they often involve hearings. So if you're obtaining a non-attainment permit, the public's going to be aware of it, the environmental organizations are going to be aware of it, and they're probably going to be contesting your permit as much as they can, whether legitimate or not. It will always happen with non-attainment permits. And that increases the time frame it takes to obtain your non-attainment permit. So something you definitely need to consider. PSD permitting, you have to do modeling. So you'll model for ambient air impacts. You'll model against the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and you can do an incremental modeling analysis. Other impacts, you have to look at endangered species, ground and water pollution, and associated growth. Associated growth is something that refers to if you're doing adding a new unit to your process or to your plant, and it's going to allow you to increase the jobs at your facility. Maybe it'll add 20 new jobs at your facility because you're building a brand new unit. You'll have to look at the associated growth associated with the surrounding area that will also take place as a result of you expanding your process and the emissions associated with that. And you also have to consider secondary emissions, so emissions from vehicles and things like that. So first thing we're going to talk about when it comes to developing our permit application for PSD permit is the best available control technology. So it applies to PSD major source permitting. It may apply to minor source permitting depending on your state regulations. So Texas requires BACT for all of their minor source permits, but there's a lot of states that don't require BACT at all. It cannot be less than any federal regulation. So if there's a federal regulation for your emission source that establishes a limit, emission limit, that is the highest emission rate that can be used to determine what BACT is. The method to determine BACT may vary by state. So what most people are familiar with is the EPA method, which is a top-down method. Texas uses a three-tiered approach, and I've seen other states use a variation on both approaches, where they will list out what they believe is BACT, and you'll use the top-down method to work from that level of BACT technology to what you can actually use. So the EPA top-down methodology. The first step is to identify all available potential control technologies. So, in this case, let's use a process vent as an example. You look at all the control technologies that you can use on your process vent to reduce emissions. So you'll list out a flare. I mean, that's usually very easy to use. A thermal oxidizer can combust the process vent. A boiler, if it's designed properly, can be used as a control device. Depending on the solubility, you can use a water scrubber to reduce emissions. So you list out all these different potential control technologies out in the top-down method. And then the next step is to eliminate any technically infeasible options. Well, in this case, if your VOCs aren't soluble in water, scrubber is technically infeasible because you're not going to be reducing emissions. Likewise, if there is, if you're looking at, let's say, NOx from a boiler, a lot of times SCR is currently being used to determine what as a BACT control technology. SCR is selective catalytic reduction, and it's used to reduce your NOx emissions. Well, if the process vents that you're sending through your boiler can destroy the catalyst and make the catalyst ineffective, well, that eliminates SCR technology for NOx on your boilers because it's technically infeasible. So once you've removed all those options, you'll rank the remaining control technologies by their control effectiveness. So with the VOC process vents, we talked about flare, thermal oxidizer, boiler. Well, we know a boiler can be 99.9%. Sometimes they can be certified higher. That might be one of the highest control efficiencies. Thermal oxidizers, if designed properly, can be 99.9%. Flares will typically be 98%. We talked about those earlier on in the calculations. You'd rank them by their destruction removal efficiencies, or in the case of a scrubber, removal efficiency, and look at all their, rank them from the one that could remove the most VOCs to the one that removes the least. So once you've done that, you evaluate each control option and document the results. In this case, step 4, you're eliminating your options due to technical, energy, environmental, or economic impacts. So at this point, once you've removed all the technically infeasible options, you're looking at environmental options and economic impacts that would eliminate control options. So let's say whatever control technology you're using is going to be emitting additional chemicals. In the case of a combustion device, you're going to be emitting lots of NOx and CO, and it creates an environmental impacts that are too high for that specific area. Well, that eliminates all of your combustion control devices. So that would be one thing you could remove from your environmental, is if you can demonstrate that the impacts from your control device are worse than the impacts that or the process event that you're controlling, well then you can eliminate that as an option. Where most people go with this step is the economic impacts. If you can demonstrate that the amount of emissions that you're reducing, the number of tons of emissions you're reducing, is not economically viable based on the control technology that you're using, you can eliminate something from, eliminate a control device in that way. I've seen different numbers for economic impacts, but one of the most common I've seen get thrown out is usually around $16,000 a ton of NOx for like a boiler comparing SCR technology with low NOx burners, thank you. And they'll use the cost of running an SCR boiler versus low NOx burners. And if that's greater than $16,000 per ton removed, or per ton of NOx removed because of the SCR technology, they'll eliminate that as one of the options. I have also seen other scenarios where that economic analysis hasn't worked out, even if it is greater than $16,000 per ton. Maybe you're only reducing a very small tonnage of emissions, so that installing that SCR, let's say that installing that SCR technology is only going to be a small percentage of your project budget. A lot of the environmental advocates are challenging PSD permits and these economic impacts, saying that, well, if you're going to be doing a $4 billion project and installing the SCR technology is only going to be, a couple $100,000, you can definitely afford that SCR technology. It doesn't matter if it's $16,000 or greater per ton that you're reducing. So we're starting to see that come into place, and is that not being an option to be taken out. But like I said, general rule of thumb, about $16,000 per ton is what's been used in the past for economic impacts. Once that is done, your best available control technology is the most effective option remaining after step 4. So whatever removes the emissions the best after all those options are removed, that's what is considered BACT. Now, as we mentioned, some other states will use a variation on both approaches. What they'll do is, instead of step 1, instead of you identifying all the available potential control technologies, they'll tell you what they think is the best available control technology, and you'll have to work back from there. Basically, they'll rank them for you. So I've seen that as an example. And in the Texas 3-tiered approach, Tier 1 is they've established what they consider BACT. They list it out in their guidance documents, tell you what it is. And Tier 2 and Tier 3 is what they're using as their elimination steps to argue your way out of that being best available control technology. So basically, step 2 is the third tier, tier 3, is going to be your technology and your economic impacts. Tier 2, I forget which. Do you remember what tier 2 is?
Tier 2 is a similar facility.
Okay, so if a similar facility, so if you can demonstrate that so in Texas, the tier 2 is if you can find a similar facility that is already operating with a different type of control technology than what TCQ is listed, you can use that as your go-by. So once you've determined what BACT is for your project, you want to go back and recalculate any of your emissions that may have changed. So you found out that, well, maybe my storage tank needed an IFR after all, and based on BACT, and not the fixed roof tank that your process engineers decided on. So you'll have to tell them, well, we need to install an IFR on this tank, and you'll then recalculate your emissions, and that's when you'll go back and determine if the project is still meeting your major source and major modification definitions. A lot of times you'll go through this BACT analysis for your project, and you'll reduce your emissions so far that you stop triggering PSD. So it's always good to identify your control technologies while you're developing your process. Make sure that they know, your process engineers know what they are ahead of time, and that'll save you time in having to go back and recalculate your emissions if you can get out of PSD by voluntarily installing control technologies that get you out of PSD permitting. So the next one is lowest achievable emission rate. So this is a lot more stringent than BACT. And the reason for that is the economic analysis does not apply. So regardless of the cost, you have to implement the control technology if it exists. It only applies to non-attainment permits. And you must look at both process design and emission controls to achieve the lowest emission rate. So that means that you're not just looking at control devices to reduce your emissions, you're also looking at other people's processes. What have they done to get lower emission rates? And you might have to go back and redesign your process in order to reduce your emissions. So I've heard a couple different situations. One is that well, the first thing is that if it's been implemented anywhere in the world, and so a plant somewhere off in Asia has some control technology that reduced emissions, you have to implement that control technology. That'll fall under your permit writer. They'll try to do the same type of research. You'll have to give them your research in terms of determining how you determined lowest achievable emission rates. There's really no process set in place to determine whether you're right or wrong. Right. It's not written out, and a lot of time.
Somebody can make a lot of claims.
Right.
I think it says something. It says something. Yes, it says the rules say something to the effect of demonstrated. So if it's been installed and demonstrated somewhere, then you can have an argument with your regulatory body about what demonstrated means. But if it's been operational, then I think that is going to be a tough argument. It doesn't have to be operational, but it's been operational somewhere. Now, if it's been installed and given up on and didn't work, well, then it probably wouldn't happen. But it's not just installed, it's also, if it's a regulatory requirement anywhere, so there's strange requirements in places that don't even have certain industries that set where. The South
California is one of the drivers for a lot of control technology because of their regulations.
Layer, and I don't know that they load any liquid onto their vessels, so that's where our layer comes from. Because it's any regulatory anywhere in the U.S. or anything that's so.
Another instance would be somebody in a lab in Europe decided they found a way to reduce VOC emissions further than anybody else. You'll have to go and determine if that's a viable option on an industrial level to determine if that's layer. So if nobody's demonstrated that, but only in a lab, as long as you can confirm that it cannot be met on an industrial level, that should be sufficient enough. But like I said earlier, a lot of non-attainment permits go into contested case hearings, and they'll contest your layer determinations and try to come up with off-the-wall ways to decrease your emissions and argue that that's layer versus what you decided to be layer. So it's
It's not layer, but it's BACT. One thing you check in the news right now, they have the carbon capture and sequestration. They have a plant that the government was funding out somewhere. They were going to capture the carbon and inject it into the deep well. And they're having to shut it down. It's going bankrupt. So there's a whole debate about, well, why are you talking about this being? So it's debatable.
Well, why did you go bankrupt? Financial reasons or for technical reasons?
I haven't followed the story enough. I just remember seeing it and seeing the highlights and kind of just skimmed it, but it looked like it was mostly financial. It just couldn't operate. So it wasn't.
Well, economically, that's hard now.
right.
That holding doesn't make any sense.
Well, the carbon sequestration would refer more to your greenhouse gases, and that would only be a PSD way to get out of BACT for PSD in greenhouse gases. There is no national ambient air quality standard established for greenhouse gases right now, so you wouldn't be triggering the layer for greenhouse gases. But yeah, if there was let's say it wasn't carbon sequestration, maybe they were able to capture NOx emissions that way. Or, somebody was to develop some control technology to collect NOx emissions and throw them into the ground. Well, if somebody were to demonstrate that that's a viable option, then if you're triggering non-attainment, that would be something that you might have to do. So.
I've never come across this, but you do it, but, I was always wondering, standard saying, this is how we apply.
And a lot of times that's why by the time you start implementing layer technology on your process, you're falling out of non-attainment permitting altogether. So it's also one reason why most people try to avoid non-attainment permitting in the first place, because they know the cost of implementing the control technology to meet those conditions is going to cost more than what the project can handle, and it'll kill the project anyways. So a lot of times you'll hear people say that you can't permit anything in non-attainment areas. Well, this is the reason why you can't permit things in non-attainment areas, because most people can't afford to meet the control technology to implement the project in a non-attainment area. So to review everything that we just talked about, what steps are taken to determine the correct permitting action? So what was the first step that we talked about? Right, are you a major source? What was the next step? Major modification. Yeah, so you're looking at your project itself, and is it a major modification? And then the third step? Netting, right, very good. What is more stringent, BACT or layer, and why?
Layer.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Can you provide an example to eliminate a BACT option? Economics, correct. How about one more? Environmental impact? Feasibility. Technical feasibility. Very good. All right. The next section will be regulatory applicability. We've got about 10 minutes before break. So we can break now and come back at the end of the break time. Get an extra 10 minutes for your break. We finished early.
All right, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, the rules. So it's important to understand the rule structure because that's where it's the foundation for all of this. You know, if the agency came and told you to do something that's not in the rules, well, they don't have the right to tell you to do it. So it's important to know what is in the rules because that's where, you know, they get the right to tell you what to do. And that's also where your requirements come from, because there's also times that you have to do stuff that no one's going to tell you what to do. You're just required to do it by rule, and so you need to be able to navigate the rules. So it's also where like you can find out more about specific applicability determinations for Title V, for PSD. All of that is laid out in the rules. So we'll talk more about the structure in a minute. Before you go to the rules, though, it's important to kind of get a lay of the land of your own site so that you know what your major pieces of equipment are, what your major emissions are, what your major emission constituents are, because that will help you navigate where in the rules you should go. And then once you know where to go in the rules, you can you can figure out which requirements apply to you. So the main ones that we're going to talk about now that we haven't talked about yet are NSPS, NESHAP, and MAERT. So these are found in 40 CFR Part 60, that's in NSPS, Part 61, that's NESHAP, and Part 63, that's MAERT. So NSPS stands for New Source Performance Standards. So if you're building something new, then you need to look in Part 60. All right, the NESHAP NSPS applies to new things, all right? So that's where Part 60 is. If you're gonna emit a hazardous air pollutant, that's that list of 180 constituents. That list is gonna be regulated by Part 61. And then Part 63 applies to specific units. So if you go to the heading of Part 63, to the table of contents, you'll see specific units within a plant, and each one of those will be regulated independently, and those requirements will be found in Part 63. Do we have that handout?
No.
I think that's the 2-day. Yeah, I think that's the 2-day class.
In the 2-day course, we would go through specific regulations and practice reading through some handouts because we have an extra day and have extra time.
Yeah.
Give you a chance to compare the differences in some of the rules.
So reading the rules can be tedious. This looks like a rule, but it's not. This is a table of contents. So getting through them can be very difficult because a lot of times rules are a lot of cross references. So it'll be referencing another part of the rule that's somewhere else, and you'll be flipping back pages, and there's lots of post-it notes and lots of paper clips and lots of highlighting in multiple colors, and go ahead and print it out in the Federal Register because the Federal Register has big margins and you'll want to take notes. I just wanted to put this up here to point out that the rules can be very long and very tedious. So don't think that if you're having trouble with it, it's not just you. Feel free to get some help. But they are all set up in generally the same way. The federal rules are all going to start with applicability and then go on into definitions. Then they're going to have emissions and or control standards. They're going to talk about monitoring and testing. They're going to talk about record keeping, and they're going to talk about reporting. So you should be able to easily find each one of these sections in each rule, and you should know the differences. So here's an example of the NESHAP for equipment leaks, which is subpart H. And you can see that it is set up with applicability, definitions, standards, alternative, test method, record keeping, reporting, and enforcement. Right? So you would start with applicability, you'd read the applicability section and see, does this rule apply to me or not? If it doesn't apply to me, then I don't need to read the rest, right? Because none of it matters to me. If it does apply to me, then I can look at the standards. And in reading the standards, there'll be some words that are going to be vague, like refinery, or like facility, or tank, or whatever. And you'll need to read the definition. And then you'll see next to the definition of something else that you thought meant one thing, but actually means something else. Okay? So it's important to know all the definitions because they change from rule to rule. So when you're reading rules, you always start with what is the closest definition. We've talked about how source means 3 different things. We've talked about how facility means 3 different things. For the people that are at refineries, refinery means 4 different things in the rules. So you always reference whatever the closest definition to you is, and then you can back up from there. So if there's not a definition in 63.161, then there might be a definition in 63.10, right? If there's not a definition there, then you can start to use what the common sense definition is. And if that doesn't make sense to you, then that's when you start walking the halls and asking people questions and picking up the phone and calling people. I'm sure if you haven't done that yet, you will. Because that's how reading rules works. So here's some sample rules. These are the main ones. If you have fugitives, that's going to be part 60, VV, and VVA. Engines is going to be quad I, quad J, quad K. Tanks are going to be the K series, K, A, B, C. The boilers is going to be MACT 5D. Loading has very specific situations. The process vents is going to be N, RRR.
There's also other examples
of
rules that are applicable.
This is a very, very small list, but these are headliners, right?
Sampling to start off with.
Yeah. So what are these series that we're talking about, right? So for example, tank series is the K series. Well, the series don't always make perfect analogies in and amongst themselves. So let's talk about the K series and the D series. So when we say a series, we talk about the big letter and then the little letters after it. So the K series is going to be K, KA, KB. So K goes based on time. So they started back in 1978. So a tank that was constructed or modified before 78 is K, and then after 78 is KA, and then after 84 is KB. All right? But that's not the way that the D series works. The D series has a mixing of time and size and utility. So D started with the big fossil fuel steam generating units. So your big steam boilers over 250 million BTUs. And then they added in the electric generating units. And then they added in those over 100 million BTUs, and now we're down to over 10 million BTUs, right? So they're kind of like they're pulling in more and more and more to the applicability, okay? So it's not always based on time for series. There's the federal rules. That's all the federal rules are going to be in 40 CFR, but there's other rules that you need to know depending on where you are. So there's also going to be state rules. So if your state has a minor source program, then you need to know the state rules. So the Texas rules are in 30 TAC. Well, the Texas air permitting rules are in 30 TAC. There's other rules elsewhere, but all the air permitting rules are in 30 TAC. So like NSR is in 116, PBR is in 106, PSD is in 112. So that's all in 30 TAC. Other states will have their own state rules that you need to know. And they'll have more stringent requirements dependent upon where the site is located. So like 117 has NOx limits that apply to the non-attainment areas. So you'll have to look out for those. And there's also state-only rules like PBR programs and things like that in Texas.
So some states, they only incorporate the federal rules by reference. So that is their state rules, federal rules incorporated by reference. Smaller states that don't necessarily do a lot of environmental control and don't have personnel to deal with large facilities, they just reference the federal rules. That second bullet, state-only rules that are federally enforceable. So those are the regulations that definitely you'll have more requirements for control on the equipment and that are specific to certain areas of the state. Usually, you'll find these types of rules with clean non-attainment areas. So states are trying to improve the air quality in those non-attainment areas, and so they have what they call reasonable technology requirements. And then those state-only regulations. Sometimes there's areas that the rule itself isn't federally enforceable, primarily because it doesn't have to deal with control technology. And so you'll have to be in compliance with those state-only rules. And so there's a wide variety that you have to look at. Depending on where you're located, you might have a lot of regulations you need to do on the state level, or you might just have to use federal rules that apply.
Yeah, in Texas, we make some of our PBRs federally enforceable by certifying them. The PI7 cert, if you're familiar with that. So you certify using a PI7 cert, and that's how it becomes federally enforceable.
And if you're not familiar with term PBRs, PBRs stand for permit by rules. In Texas, it's a minor source form of permit. There's some states that follow that same format. They basically allow you to construct minor sources that are authorized by a regulation. That would be a state-only rule that doesn't necessarily make it federally enforceable, but they allow some of those local registries, what they call PBRs, to make them federally enforceable. Yeah, that'd be an example of a specific PBR in Texas. But there's other states that have variations on PBRs. Texas has a very well-defined program for permit by rules. But there's other states that say any emission source that emits less than 25 tons per year of VOCs is permitted by rule. It's just how they decide to operate. It varies from state to state, like it varies from state to state, and if the rule is there to authorize an emission source, they may or may not be federally enforceable, depending on how your state operates.
Yes.
Okay. When we were talking about the 2.7 credit, there are instances where clients say, this is what we found.
Mm-hmm.
They don't do a 2.7 credit. Like, this is one of the things that has always been used, right? When do you want to use a 2.7 credit and when do you not want to use it?
It's up to them.
Yeah. Because it's Texas state specific, we can talk about that afterwards.
documents relating to how they authorize management permitting. I was doing research for air authorizations for oil and gas well sites a couple of years ago. It's about 4 or 5 states in plenty of states areas, and you'd be surprised how varied and how simple some of those states are authorize their emission, their right of first emission sources. They do provide at least a little bit of guidance to direct you to the regulations that oversee their right of first permitting. They have guidance documents that direct you to registration forms that they might have for those types of small authorizations. And yes, the TCP does have laws for the PUI program for pretty much every state that we have a course to work with. I think the longer the websites have been up, the more and more content that the state agencies are adding to their websites to give people guidance to properly operate their emission sources. So it's, they realize that more and more people are using their websites for technical purposes and want to help out people in their state as much as possible.
Okay, so if you were unclear about a rule and you were first going to read it, what section of the federal regulations are best to look at to first determine if your site is applicable? Okay. What are the different sections of the federal regulations? We got one of them.
Definitions,
Reporting, record keeping, monitoring. Yeah. Those are all good ones. You're going to want to pay attention to each one of them, right? Because some of them will require a semi-annual report. Well, what goes in the semi-annual report? Got to look at reporting, and then it'll reference what, what monitoring needs to be reported and what record keeping needs to be kept and all that. Sometimes you just have to keep records. Sometimes you have to keep records and report it. Okay, so that's the rules. I'm going to grab my water. So we've been through a lot of the permitting process, right? So we're going to start the permitting process with the management of change. We've identified our sources. We decided what type of permit we want to, what type of permit we need at the site. And we have determined what rules apply at the site. So now we need to get the permit moving. So the permit application is, of course, going to depend on where you are. Is that a recurring theme? So some sites have 2 permit applications, some sites have 1. But generally, the applications are going to include these things. You're going to need a description of the process, which is going to include a text description and the process flow diagram, and you'll also want a text description of what the project is. You'll add those emission calcs that we talked about before. You'll want a description of the site outside of the project, where the site sits, what's around the site. That'll be a map. You'll need a plot plan. You'll want to talk about the regulatory applicability that we just went through, which federal rules apply, what monitoring and what record keeping is required by those federal rules. If it's going to be required by a case-by-case permit or something like that, then you'll want to include what your interpretation of BACT and what layer is. The agency will do its own review and they'll look at yours. And you'll probably have to do an impacts analysis, which can be both a health impacts analysis or a NACS analysis. And if you're doing a non-attainment, then you should probably go in talking about offsets so that the agency doesn't come back and say, what are you doing about offsets? That should be sort of pre-thought about. Within your project, you should be working with all the members that are involved to figure out who has the final say on major decisions, What are the deadlines for these decisions? When do the decisions need to be made? When do things need to be complete? What are the phases of the permitting project itself? There's the major project, but there's also the permitting project. What are the phases? And then keep that up to date. As the large project evolves, as they tend to, then you'll need to update your permitting project as well. All of that information will need to be included in the application, and I'll show you how that gets included. You'll also include what type of permit you're seeking, and you'll need to think about whether you're including trade secrets, how to include those, whether they need to go under confidential header, what information is going to be available to the public and what is not, and how it's submitted to different agencies. For emissions calcs, it's usually best to present them in an organized fashion, because you have to realize that somebody is going to be reading these that was not involved in the preparation of them. So you have to be very thoughtful about presentation. So you always want to think about presenting emissions calcs as a story. You'll do a narrative description of your emissions calcs, as well as tables that summarize them nicely and then go into more and more detail in succession. So you'll start with a site-wide summary that talks about these are the emissions at the site and this is how they're changing as the project. And then you'll go into each individual unit and how those were calculated. You'll need process-specific forms, and the netting exercise, if it's required, will be its own calc independent of the emission rates. For each one of the calcs, if you're doing 100 tanks, then you can just submit 100 rows and do one sample calculation. So if you're doing something that's very repetitive, you can do a sample calculation and then do the very repetitive thing. But every single calc needs at least one sample calculation that isn't just a table, that's not just a table of numbers, but shows formulas filled out so that somebody that can't see the equations behind the Excel table will see a real equation. And that's what we call sample calculations. It doesn't need to be there for every single line, but at least one example of every calc should be there. And you should also provide backup documentation. So an example of backup documentation may be if your vendor says that this piece of equipment can achieve 99.9% destruction efficiency, well, that letter, the vendor saying that, should be included in the application. Because your word is nice and you're signing the application, but your vendor, that supporting documentation should be part of the package. Are there questions about how to present that? Okay.
With your work with TCQ, were there times that people with their applications with digital files in their Excel calculations?
At the agency, you have to submit paper, and then yes, we would get digital as well. Depending on the thoroughness of the review that I was performing, I would sometimes ask. So that's going to kind of be up to you. Lots of people are very guarded about their digital calculations, which is understandable, but that's going to raise suspicion if you're guarded about it. I think if that's requested of you, you should probably provide it. It may be more work for you because lots of times in the preparation you're not preparing the digital calculations for presentation to the agency, and so now you have to go back and scrub them, right? But I think that if it's specifically requested, it should probably be provided, but not on the first round. So, at least in Texas, give them paper, and if they ask for digital, then give it to them.
Well, now, when it comes to Title V applications, that would be something that you wouldn't necessarily be submitting emission calculations for. But the EPA, the regional office in Dallas for Region 6, has requested all their Title V applications be submitted to them digitally now in a PDF format, so that they aren't receiving paper copies anymore.
Yeah. That'd be nice if the agency were on that page, if the TCQ were on that page, but the EPA also has a habit of putting everything online. So if you are submitting, trade secrets to the EPA, you have to think closely about that, because they have just because it's stamped confidential does not mean that it won't get scanned and put online. So you have to pay special attention when you're submitting trade secrets to the EPA, to Region 6. I've seen that confidential stamp on a lot of things. So there are some state-specific forms that request things like site information, that request process information. Fugitive information is another thing that will be kind of state-specific. There's some control forms, Texas has a couple. They're not always used. Depends. Regulatory applicability forms in Texas. This would be the table 2 and 3F. The fee, how the fee is calculated. Each state has a different fee form on how to calculate the fees, and then you have to submit a form that shows how you calculated the fees. And then certifications. So depending on what state you're supplying in, go to their website and there'll be instructions on how to submit the application and make sure that you're using their forms, because they'll want them. And this is an example of forms. This is the Texas registration form, and this is the LDEQ registration form. And it's basically the same stuff. It's facility identification information and personal contact information. So it's like, what facility is this? Where is the facility? Where is it located? How do you get to it? And who do we contact? Who's the person that's going to be signing? And who's the person that we talk to if we have technical questions? All right, so that information is on both of these forms. It's just oriented in different ways. So that's what I'm talking about. You have to use the state-specific forms. And they have parallel forms for fees and for all the other stuff. So after you get your package all put together and it's this high and stacked up like they showed in the picture, like it tends to be, then you send it off, and you usually don't hear back for a very long time, much longer than you think you will. And then you hear back. And what's happening on the other side is the review process. So, oh, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry. This is before you send it off. There's the review process internally, right? So you'll have your internal review process. Depending on the application, it will need to be signed by a responsible official. So Title V's applications, for example, need to be signed by the RO, but a pre-construction authorization doesn't. Depending on the size, some applications require a PE stamp, some don't. And then, you can either depending on the application, you can hand deliver, but send it certified some way so that you know when it got there and have a return receipt. So Texas operates by the mailbox rule, which means that the agency received it on the day it is postmarked. But just because it was postmarked does not mean that it was received. So that's why certified mail or FedEx or hand delivery is, the way to go. Because then you have that, verification that the agency actually has it. And if something happens, then you can be like, look, I have the thing that says that you got it. And then when you do hear back from the reviewer, right, the reviewer should contact you at some time. Be an active participant in the review process. It'll make the review go faster. Express your concerns, express your wants. If you have a start of construction, reiterate a start of construction date already, reiterate that start of construction date. Make sure they're aware of that, even though it's written there on page 1 or 2. Make sure they know it at the very front so that they know how to prioritize their projects. And make sure you're participating. So now is what I was talking about. So you've sent it off. And state-by-state processes vary. I, worked in a TCEQ, so my experience is obviously very Texas-leaning. But they vary. But in general, this is what is, sort of required by the federal rules, so what you'll see everywhere. You will have a public notice depending on the size. You'll have, the agency is obviously going to review it. You'll have some type of screening, health effects screening, or NACS or NACS analysis, which will usually include modeling. The agency will write you a draft permit, and then you have to chance to comment on that draft. And then this public notice can come at the beginning, at the end, or both. And of course, processing and timing vary drastically from state to state, from project to project, from reviewer to reviewer. There's so many influencing factors that influence timing, so it's hard to guess. The public notice is something that is sometimes overlooked, but is a regulatory requirement and is something that agencies are generally inflexible. Well, it's unpredictable what things they'll be flexible on and what things they won't. So things like, is the address of the site correct? Is the permit number correct? Are the pollutants listed on the public notice correct? Are things that you will definitely want to check before you publish. Because if they're wrong, you'll have to republish. There's other random things that if they get mistakes, you may not have to republish. I had one that published their entire public notice with no spaces and didn't have to republish. I made sure from my boss's boss's boss that they did not have to republish. And I didn't understand that, because if you misspell carbon dioxide, then you have to republish. But if you don't put a space between carbon and dioxide or any other word in the entire public notice, then it's okay. So, whatever. Yeah, they literally published the entire public notice with no spaces. And whatever, I don't know. Don't ask me. But yeah, you'll want to check, because there's specific requirements in Texas about margin size and about box size on what's published in the readily accessible and what's in the back. And if you're publishing in a small newspaper that doesn't do a lot of notices, or Spanish newspapers too, they may not pay attention to that when you send them. So check your proof very closely, because that is it's not only costly in publication, but it's also costly in permitting time. If your project gets delayed 2 months because you have to do another a notice period, that's a lot of time just in delaying the project start.
I had a newspaper, so in Texas we have to publish the notice in 2 different locations in the same newspaper. One's just a brief little description of
Yeah, and the easy to see, and up near the front.
This is the entire permit permitting process, and the newspaper left out the second part of the published notice in the newspaper, and luckily we found out before the published notice needed to be published, so we were able to go back to the newspaper and say, hey, you guys screwed up, and that's for that part of this needs to be published, and we got it done in time. But it's make sure you look at the actual newspaper that went out, and make sure that your public notice was done correctly and it shows up in that actual newspaper.
In our case, our state newspaper only publishes once a month.
Yeah, be careful how you choose your Spanish newspaper, because in Texas you have to use the same newspaper for your first notice and your second notice. So it doesn't matter on your first notice, but your second notice can really change things. So choose your Spanish newspaper specifically, because your second notice is important. Really, if you've never done public notice before, get some help, especially in Texas, because it's not just these timing issues. The forms around public notice make absolutely no sense. It's just all of public notice is a giant mess. And if you've never done it before, make sure you're not going through it alone, because it's a very, very important part of the process, and it is not logical. Okay, enough about public notice. And I hope I've scared you, because you should be. Okay. So, of course, another big period of the review cycle that we haven't talked about is the deficiency cycle. That'll just happen. But the thing that you need to pay special attention to is the permit conditions. So don't gloss over that. Don't be like, oh, thank goodness we finally have our permit conditions, let's go. When you get those permit conditions, you need to pay special attention, because that is your point of negotiation when the permit is being issued. It's a lot harder to come back and unravel something that's been issued than it is to negotiate before it's been issued. So pay special attention to your permit conditions, because these permit conditions can be enforced upon. It's important to review all the conditions to make sure that you can comply with them, right? And also to include other people at your site, right? Bring operations in, make sure if there's other rule holders at your site, if there's other reg owners, bring them in. Anyone that this, some people require legal to be in the loop, I'll leave up to you. So if you have more than one permit at a site, some sites will, like chop up their site into multiple NSR permits, compare it against your other NSR permits and see what is going to be different about this NSR permit than your others, to see if there's consistency issues. Look specifically at monitoring and record keeping. Sometimes those can be overly onerous, and other times you'll already be exceeding them by some other requirement, and you can maybe get something taken out that's not necessary. So just pay special attention to your permit conditions, and make sure that there's something that you can live with. And but at the same time, you don't want to play too much of a hard ball. Just if you're gonna be negotiating, you have to have a reason to want something to be changed. So just like, oh, this is too hard, isn't really a great reason, and somebody else got something better isn't that much of a reason either. You need to understand why that someone else got something better than you before you bring that up, because it's not really going to be enough. They may have had a legitimate reason, or they may not. And if you come and say why they got that reason, then you're on strong ground.
One example that I always give is most state agencies have default language that they put in to get permits for monitoring, especially control devices, and making sure that they work properly. Sometimes the monitoring is periodic monitoring, and I had one client that was going to have to take monthly samples to demonstrate that they were in compliance with the control device. And they came up to me and said, well, why are we going to have to do these periodic monitoring? We already have a continuous monitor on this control device. Can't we just do the continuous monitoring and get out of it? So we negotiated with the agency to change the conditions to match what they were actually doing and how they're actually monitoring to make sure that the control device is working. So they went above what the state was requiring, but it meant that they had to do less work in the long run. So they didn't have to do the monthly sampling.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of giving a reason why we don't want right? Why we don't want the monthly monitoring. We're already doing this other thing. We'll just put a record-keeping requirement in the permit, and that should go away easily. Where if you just say, I don't want to do monthly monitoring, well, that's not coming out. And now if somebody else looks at the permit and says, well, Jim didn't have to do monthly monitoring, why should I have to do monthly monitoring? Well, they don't know the whole story. So this, comparison to another permit can be tricky. You probably should do benchmarks against another permit to see what these boilerplate language is and what you'll be expected to do. But if you want something changed, you should provide a reason. Also, make sure you're responding by the agency's deadlines, especially in this phase, because they also want to get this permit issued. They're not going to move on without you, but you're going to lose a lot of your negotiating ground if they say, please provide comments in 30 days, and 30 days have gone by and you haven't provided comments. So make sure you're responding within the agency's timelines, especially in this phase. And I've already talked about this other stuff. And generally there can be tension between the agency and the applicant during this phase, but in the grand scheme of things, you have to keep your relationship with the agency in balance with your operations. So this won't be the last time that you're in front of them, and the agency is not as big as you think they are. So that goes both ways, right? They're not necessarily as powerful as you think they are, and you can get a lot out of them, but they have institutional memory the next time you come back. So that's how you treat them. Just make sure you're approaching it professionally. If they write to you, then you should write back using the same language. All right? Okay, so after you get the permit, the special conditions are kind of going to be boilerplate. They're going to be state specific. They should be generally the same for everyone, but they do have rooms for negotiation like we've been talking about. Make sure you understand them. Make sure everyone that's involved understands them. And when you finally get the issued permit after public notice, make sure you read it, because this permit is issued by people, and I've made a mistake. During an alteration, I issued a permit without the appendix, right? So it was like I was altering a permit and then I issued it without the appendix, and so they were suddenly not authorized to emit this list of like 20 compounds because I just, it was a separate document, and when I printed it and sent it off to the people that issue the permits and mail it out, I didn't include it. So then the applicant got it in the mail and called me and was like, hey, I don't have this appendix. And so I had to like fix it. So don't just assume that when it comes in the mail, it's done. You need to go back through it and make sure everything is still there and that the changes that you asked for got changed and the permit is still complete and that it makes sense. That's a good final check. You should use this time to determine what your compliance timelines are, right? There'll be changes in the permit. When are the testing requirements? When are the reporting requirements? Update your compliance programs based on all that. Are you going to need ongoing compliance certifications? And then that should be that for issuing permits. Are there any questions about the permit application review process? Anything you've ever want to ask an agency reviewer? No? Okay. So we went through the whole permitting process overview. So back to the training agenda. Our last main item is state-specific air permits. So
Before before we start the section, usually when we give the presentation in individual states, we try to focus on who's attending and try to develop content. Of course, he's a bigger animal. It's hard to you lose too many people if you focus on one state in particular. So we have a general overview of local state permitting. But if you have any specific questions about how your state does air permits, first somebody currently teaching the expert class today. His claim to fame in Roy Boston Talkers class, which is we've done a permit in every single state. And so we definitely have the resources. If you have questions about your own specific state, you can get those answers for you as well.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk too much about any one specific state. I'm just going to briefly discuss the differences that we've been talking about all day, just as a wrap up. But you've heard us talk about this several times, that there's federal rules, then there's state programs, and there's also local air pollution control district specific permitting programs. So in some states, the state is responsible for the federal permit. Some states have a state-only permit type, and some states are delegated. So I think we have a map here. So here's the map of the SIP approved areas. So the green are the states that have the SIPs. These are the state implementation plans. So these are the ones that meet the federal rules or do better, and the state has developed its own program that is not cookie cutter, but is specific to its own state. The EPA or delegated is where the EPA either does the permitting or it's just referenced by EPA rules. And then these are going to be combinations. California is broken up into air pollution control districts that will have like their own weird SIPs and whatnot. State and local air pollution control areas can be responsible for federal permits. They'll do the PSD and the NSR. When a state is delegated, they do the federal rules, and then the promulgation is when they do the implementation plan, like I was saying. Federal authority only is in like tribal areas or what's called a federal implementation plan.
So there was a point in time in the last year or two when we first started doing greenhouse gas permitting across the nation. Texas had a federal implementation plan for greenhouse gas permitting, but they had a SIP for the rest of the permitting. So that would be one example of when Texas facilities had to obtain a greenhouse gas permit. They had to submit to the EPA regional office to obtain the air permit for greenhouse gases. Right now, that program is now being, they've submitted a SIP for approval with the EPA to begin developing their own state greenhouse gas permits.
I think that's done. No, I think that's done.
It is done now?
Yeah, I think the FIP has been rescinded.
And so there'll be times when you get new federal regulations that new requirements that for a time individual states will be operating under a federal implementation plan, and other times we'll get the SIP done in conjunction with federal regulations being passed.
Yeah, so the point is that there's lots of different rules, they overlap. So it's not only it's not only based on what state you're in, but it's also what rule you're talking about to determine which agency you're going to. So state-only permitting types are going to be the federally enforced state operating permit. That's like the Title V. The minor source federally enforced state operating permit is a little different than Title V. The minor source construction, minor source operation, general permit by rule, and then registration, which we have in Texas, we have permit by rules that are registered and permits by rules that are not registered. Other states will just have registrations. So these are all different types of federal-only permits that you might see. So, sorry, state-only permits that you might see. So if you see one of these, you know, you should be first thinking that this is a state-only permit. Federally enforced state operating permit. It's an operating permit, but that's federally enforceable. So we've discussed a lot of these as we've been going through the class previously, but different states will treat minor sources differently, like we've been saying. Different states include specific requirements to state specific, to their individual states that aren't in the federal rules. They are based on the type of source and the type of permit that's required. Insignificant activities are permitted differently state by state. So in Texas, it would be the de minimis level or a PBR. In other states, the de minimis level would be higher. States will be more or less stringent depending upon the type of activity that's going on in the state and also the air quality in the state. So it's just important to know the rules in the locality. Other states are going to have the programs that are just the same as the federal rules. This reduces the paperwork for the state. It's easier for the state, you know, and if you have a big company that's operating in multiple states, it makes the rules more consistent. There's also, like we've said, not just state programs, but there's county, city. There's some associated with buildings. They all have their own forms and fees, and some will have associated inspections. So keep your eye out for that. If you're building in a location that you're not familiar with, it may not just be a federal permit. You may need some local authorization. Okay, so I know I moved through those last slides very quickly, but I wanted to see if there was anything else that we talked about throughout the day that was still sticking in your brain as confusing, or something that you thought was important that didn't get brought up. Yeah.
Just a general question. The title for the 5 Marathon has quite a large title 5, it's over 400 pages.
Yes.
Yeah, and so what would you suggest that it should reduce the size of that?
Well, you're not really going to reduce the size of the document. It's going to be, the Title V in Texas is going to be every single facility is going to have to be incorporated. Now, if you're looking to understand the Title V, don't read it. Read its statement of basis, which is sort of like a parallel document to the Title V, and it talks about where all the requirements come from. So if you were trying to like get your head around that facility's Title V, Title V in Texas is really, it's in Kentucky. Okay.
Title V in general, in really air permits in general, you're not going to be able to actually reduce the size of the permit, even on the number of pages that it takes up. Every single part of that permit is there for a reason. You submitted something in an application that generates a special condition or generates a table that, at least on the Title V, your Title V is listing out all of your applicable regulations. So each thing that you suggest are applicable to the school, it'll generate something that populates your conditions and shows you what regulations you're applicable to, and Trying to reduce the size so that you can understand what's in your Title V, that would be an entirely different story. A lot of what's in Title V permits is going to be say the same information over and over.
Yeah, it's going to be very redundant because like for every tank that's similar, that's a fixed roof tank, it's going to have the same requirement. It's going to repeat it over and over and over and over again for each one of those tanks.
If you want to reduce the file size so that it's understandable for other people outside of environmental or air group, that would be one way to do it. Just start summarizing all of your emission sources and what they're for.
You can make groups, you know, vents that go to a flare, tanks that are uncontrolled, and that, but that won't be in your Title V permit. Yeah, that. Yeah, it won't.
A regulatory applicability summary for that Title V permit, and you can put it in layman's terms.
Yeah.
Group things, and you show all of these things that have the same requirements. This whole page and a half of tanks have these requirements listed, you know, testing, monitoring, and that's what I did, so that a normal person can look at it and say, what exactly does this mean? What it means. Even that document is pretty long.
It's still going to be big. Yeah, Title V is an exercise in cryptography. You know, think of it. I don't know if you saw that movie about the Enigma machine, but you have to like think of something that somebody can understand, write it in something that Title V can understand, and Title V spits back out something that, you know, and then you have to uncryptograph it into something back that somebody can understand. So
Your Title V permit
it's
is
coding.
a legal document that if you're in a violation of that and you have to go to court, that is something that is going to be looked at very carefully to determine if you are in violation of it. Same thing with your special conditions are worded so specifically that a lawyer can dissect those special conditions. Those are legal documents that you can get taken to court for and watch for violations. Definitely software available that people have taken to that have used to document when you have an official requirement coming up and you need to do something. Make sure you save a bunch of information. Lots of the programs that can keep the environmental accountable.
Yeah, that's a good question, but Title V is a monster. Yeah. Was there anything else? Yeah.
Yeah,
That was part of the 2-day course.
In the 2-day course, we do some practice of reading over some small sections of various rules. Give everybody a little bit of practice reading the rule and figuring out the differences between specific rules and what your applicability might be. So it's more of a breakout session that we have to cut out because it's shorter time. They won't really help you with anything. It's literally one small section of the regulation. I can point you in the direction of where you can find the federal regulations to read them, but it's like a specific document.
That pink and the blue looks the same. Did your colors come out in the?
Illinois, Minnesota, and Washington.
Oh, Washington.
Massachusetts, and DC. So a few more than 3.
Well, these are EPA or delegated areas, so that could be a delegated. That could be a delegation. Yeah, this color is EPA or delegation. I don't know off the top of my head. Well, we'll stick around and be happy to chat with you if you have any more specific concerns. But thanks for joining us today. And I didn't see anyone fall asleep, so good job, everyone. Pat on your back. Feel free to leave those reviews back there if you care to. And we'll see you around the rest of the conference. Thanks for coming, y'all.